There is no warning, no noise, no panic, no reason to stop and look around. It feels like any other day. A baker checks his oven, adjusting the heat with quiet precision. A merchant counts coins in the shade, focused on numbers that still seem to matter. Someone steps across the street, carefully using raised stones to avoid the mud. Nothing is out of place. The city moves the way it always does. Steady, familiar, alive. And in the distance, a mountain stands. It does not smoke. It does not shake. It does not demand attention. No one is watching it. No one is thinking about what it could do. But within hours, everything here will disappear. Not in chaos, not in war. In the middle of a normal day. That is what defines Pompeii. It was not a city waiting to end. It was a city fully in motion. But people were not preparing to leave. They were planning what came next. And that is what makes this moment difficult to recognize. Because nothing feels wrong until it is already too late. Pompeii was not isolated, and it was not insignificant. It sat near the Bay of Naples, in one of the most fertile regions of southern Italy, connected by roads and sea routes that kept goods, people, and information moving in and out every day. This was a place shaped over time. Long before Roman control, it had already absorbed influences from the Samnites and the Greeks. When Rome established authority, the city did not restart. It adapted, layer by layer, keeping what worked and reshaping what did not. That history mattered. It meant Pompeii was not designed all at once. It grew. It adjusted. It responded to pressure, opportunity, and change. By the 1st century, it had become a functioning urban system, not monumental in the way Rome was, but efficient, active, and deeply connected to its surroundings. Trade moved through its streets. Decisions were made within its walls. Lives unfolded in patterns that repeated day after day. Nothing about it suggested fragility. If anything, Pompeii gave the impression of continuity, a place that had already lasted and would likely continue to do so. And that assumption, quiet and unchallenged, shaped how people saw the world around them. If you wanted to understand how Pompeii worked, you would begin at the Forum. Not because it was the largest space, but because everything important passed through it. Here, law was not abstract. It was spoken, not argued, enforced. Agreements were not distant ideas. They were negotiated face to face. Authority was not hidden. It stood in plain view. The Forum gathered functions that defined public life, political, religious, economic, all concentrated into one shared space. At its northern end stood the Temple of Jupiter. From there, you could see across the open square, the columns, the movement of people. And beyond it, the outline of a mountain rising in the distance. That alignment was easy to ignore. The temple represented order, stability, divine protection. The mountain behind it seemed no different from any other part of the landscape. There was no sense of opposition between them, no tension, no reason to read one as a threat to the other. And so the Forum continued to function as it always had, a place where the city made decisions about its future, without questioning the ground it stood on. Nothing in that space suggested that the horizon itself could change. 17 years before that final day, the ground had already shifted. In 62 AD, a powerful earthquake struck the region, damaging temples, houses, streets, and public buildings across the city. It was not a distant memory. It was something people still lived with. By the year 79, Pompeii was still in the process of repairing what had been broken. Scaffolding stood against walls that were not yet finished. Stone blocks waited to be set in place. Some buildings had been restored. Others remained incomplete, paused somewhere between damage and recovery. This matters more than it first appears, because it means Pompeii was not a city frozen in perfection. It was a city in transition. Work was ongoing. Resources were being allocated. Decisions were being made about what to rebuild, what to replace, and what could be left as it was. Life did not stop because of the earthquake. It adjusted and continued. People returned to their routines. Businesses reopened. Public life resumed. The damage became part of the background. And over time, what had once been a disruption began to feel like something manageable, something already overcome, which made it easier to believe that whatever came next could be handled the same way. Leave the Forum and the city changes. The open space gives way to narrower streets, where movement becomes slower, are more deliberate. The ground is uneven. The sidewalks are raised. And across the road, stone blocks form a path, not for decoration, but for crossing without stepping into mud and waste. Wheel ruts cut into the surface, marking years of repeated use. This is where Pompeii becomes tangible, not as an idea, but as a system that people move through every day. A bakery operates with heat that never fully fades, producing bread for a steady flow of customers. A thermopolium serves food quickly, its counter open to the street, designed for people who do not stop for long. Workshops open directly onto the road, where production and transaction happen in the same space. There is little separation between private and public life. Everything is visible. Everything is close. The city is dense, active, and practical, built around what needs to function, not what needs to impress. And in these streets, routine is not a concept. It is something you can see, hear, and follow step by step. Nothing here suggests interruption, only continuation. In Pompeii, much of daily life did not happen behind closed doors. It unfolded in spaces that were meant to be shared. The public baths are the clearest example. They were not reserved for a small elite, nor were they occasional luxuries. They were part of a regular routine. People came to wash, but they also came to talk. News moved through these rooms. Connections were formed. Arrangements were discussed in passing without formality. The sequence of rooms, cold, warm, hot, created a rhythm that guided movement, but the purpose extended beyond hygiene. It was social, practical, and expected. In a city like this, privacy worked differently. Conversations happened in proximity. Activities overlapped. The boundary between personal and public life remained flexible. This structure shaped how information spread, how trust was built, and how decisions were made. It also meant that when something unusual began to happen, people would not experience it in isolation. They would notice it together, discuss it together, interpret it through the same shared spaces that had always made sense of their daily lives. And that collective familiarity would influence how they responded. If you wanted to see how a city felt about itself, you would go to the amphitheater. Pompeii had one of the earliest permanent stone arenas in the Roman world. It was built to gather people, to hold attention, to create a shared focus that could be seen and heard all at once. Crowds filled the space, not only from the city, but from nearby towns as well. What happened inside was more than entertainment. It was display. It was competition. It was a way for the city to project identity beyond its walls. Victories mattered. Reputation mattered. Being seen mattered. And with that came tension. In 59 AD, a conflict during public games escalated into violence between the people of Pompeii and those from Nuceria. It was serious enough that Roman authorities intervened and imposed consequences. That moment reveals something important. These gatherings were not neutral. They carried emotion, loyalty, rivalry. The amphitheater concentrated all of it into a single place, which meant that even in times of stability, the city contained pressure beneath the surface, not always visible, but always present, shaped by the same forces that held it together. Pompeii was not a single uniform experience. Within the same walls, different ways of living existed side by side. In the center, space was limited. Streets were crowded. Movement was constant. Noise carried easily from one doorway to the next. Life unfolded in close proximity, with little distance between work, trade, and conversation. Further out, the pattern changed. Large houses and suburban villas created a different rhythm, one defined by space, control, and separation. Rooms opened into gardens. Walls carried painted scenes. Movement slowed, and what was visible could be chosen more carefully. The contrast was not only architectural, it reflected differences in status, in resources, in how people positioned themselves within the same society. A residence like the Villa of the Mysteries illustrates this clearly. Its preserved frescoes suggest ritual and meaning that are still debated, but its structure already tells a broader story. One of distance from the density of the streets, and a different way of organizing daily life. Pompeii held both worlds at once, and both were active, functioning, and fully engaged in what the next day was expected to bring. The shift did not begin with panic. Around midday, a column rose from Mount Vesuvius, tall, dense, and unlike anything most people had seen. It climbed upward, carrying ash, gas, and fragments of stone into the sky. At first, and it was something to notice, not something to flee. Pompeii was familiar with tremors. The ground had moved before, and life had continued. That memory shaped the first reactions. People looked, they spoke, they waited. Then the ash began to fall. Light changed gradually. The air thickened. Small stones, pumice, started to accumulate on roofs and in the streets, making movement slower, more uncertain. Decisions became necessary. Leave immediately, or stay and protect what you could. Search for family, or hold position and wait. There was no single response. Some moved early, others delayed. Some believed the situation would pass, as earlier disturbances had. But this was different. As conditions worsened, the city no longer functioned as it had hours before. Movement narrowed, visibility dropped, and the familiar pattern of daily life began to break apart. Moments like these, ordinary at first, then irreversible, are exactly what projects like the rebuilt timeline try to reconstruct, step by step, without exaggeration. Because what matters here is not only what happened, it is how long it took to understand that everything had changed. By night, the city no longer functioned as it had that morning. Ash continued to fall. Weight gathered on rooftops. Structures began to fail, not all at once, but in stages that reduced movement and limited options. Inside homes and along the streets, people acted on what they understood in the moment. Some tried to leave while paths were still open. Others remained, expecting the situation to stabilize. Some delayed, balancing risk against what they hoped to preserve. There was no single turning point, only a gradual loss of visibility, mobility, and time. Later phases introduced heat and fast-moving currents that ended what remained of organized response. By then, the city's normal patterns had already broken down. Afterward, there were attempts to return. Materials were taken where possible. Valuable objects were recovered in part. But over time, the site was covered and eventually left behind. Centuries later, excavation revealed something unexpected. Not just ruins, but a detailed record. Streets, spaces, and objects left in place when activity stopped. That is why Pompeii still matters, because the same event that destroyed it also preserved it. And through that, it became possible to study how a functioning city responded when its routines no longer held. This is the perspective that the rebuilt timeline continues to explore. Not the scale of the disaster, but the sequence of decisions within it. Because the question that remains is simple. At what point would you have understood that it was already too late?